I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. People talk all the time about closure when it comes to cases of a loved one being murdered. And, you know, if somebody is brought to justice or sentenced, that may be closure. If a body is found after a person has been missing, that might be closure for others. But in the case of Jason Corbett, and it's his daughter, Sarah Corbett Lynch, an author, a musician, and a young woman who has been very impressive, I think, in the face of such tragedy, has spoken about the kind of that there isn't really an end to any of this. So Molly Martens, who's her father's killer, and his former wife, who had been Sarah's au pair, and that's how she'd met her father. Of course, they moved to the US. We'll go into the detail of it in a little minute. And Jason was beaten to death. But she is moving on. And there's been an article in a UK edition of the Mail where they've spoken about her meeting a new lover and kind of moving on with her life. And there's these very romantic pictures posted. And Molly Martens is also posing for photographs looking well. But for Sarah Corbett Lynch, she said that while the world moves on and the truth gets softened, my dad, Jason Corbett, doesn't get to start over. And she's really pointing out that, you know, how he was murdered with a paving slab and a metal baseball bat in his home in North Carolina in 2015. And how, you know, her life, I suppose, was turned upside down. Read about Molly Martens, she says, if you choose. But please, she says, I'm asking you, don't reduce my father's life or my childhood to gossip. This is an important conversation. If you comment here, do it with respect.
Yeah, so the Mail obviously published this article and it included a photo of her and her new boyfriend, Molly and her new boyfriend, a guy called Josh Parrott, who's 36. I think Molly Martens is 41. Under the headline, Killer Beauty Queen Breaks Cover with Obedient Toy Boy Lover After Beating Husband to Death.
Obedient?
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, that's what it says.
Okay.
So I suppose it just reveals how Molly, they have pictures of them kissing in the park. They're not pictures that they took themselves. It looked like it was pictures taken by a photographer. You know, they weren't posing for them, I suppose. But I suppose Sarah's point would be that, you know, while, you know, this might be something that would catch people's attention because people are always interested in people being in romantic relationships, that, you know, for her, and I'm only putting words in her mouth, but from what she says, she is saying that, you know, it minimises, I suppose, the great and terrible tragedy that she was put through as a child. And obviously that cost her dad his life. But I think anybody who watched the Netflix documentary, you couldn't have watched that without your heart going out to those two kids who didn't just lose a father through a terrible violent act, but were put through this kind of psychological torture where their brains were really, she attempted to brainwash them and manipulate and control. I think at some point in her post, Sarah uses the word coercive control, but it was absolutely a valid term when you see how she attempted to manipulate those two children who had just lost. Then they were, was it 8 and 10, I think, or I could be slightly wrong with the ages, but really young kids.
I think we can safely say she's a very, very strange individual, Molly Martens.
Yeah.
You know, like it was herself and her father were originally, Thomas Martens were originally convicted in relation to Jason's death. He had met her, as I say, when she came to au pair for him in Limerick. He had just recently been widowed, having lost his first wife and the kid's mother to a very tragic asthma attack, had she died from it. And he was sort of wanting to get on with life without having to lean on his family so much for help with babysitting and help in the house. So he had decided to get an au pair, and Molly Martens popped up on his radar. she looked like the perfect choice. She was slightly older than some of the others. She had fantastic achievements, according to herself in her CV, in, I think, swimming. She was a kind of an all-American girl. And she arrived over to Limerick and quickly settled in with the family, was adoring of the two children, and soon his friends and family realised a relationship had started. So as that relationship went on, they decided to move lock, stock and barrel to North Carolina, where he got a good job, and it was nearer her own parents' home. The story goes on that basically she was very adamant that she was going to adopt those two children. And he obviously, we're surmising, Jason must have been feeling, there must have been big issues within the dynamic of their relationship, because not only was he not going to allow her adopt the children, but he was actually also he was making arrangements to bring them home to Ireland and to split from her.
Yeah, I think what happened was she was getting the feeling that he had had enough, and that these children would now ultimately, she would no longer have control of them. And I think that's what drove her to commit this terrible act. She'd kind of seeded this notion that he was abusive, even though, and she'd been secretly recording him. And all the recordings ever showed were people, a bit of tension at the home that I suppose
happens everywhere.
Yeah, it could have happened anywhere really. So she'd obviously sort of pre-prepared this kind of narrative. Her father, who was a retired FBI agent, they seem to have also fallen to a degree under her control as well. And ultimately, what her plan was to take him out and to then have full control of the children. Extraordinary, sinister and manipulative act. And that was put into effect one night when, he was effectively beaten to death in his bed. The circumstances of it, we only have the Martens, of course, to rely on.
But what we know is that he was beaten to death with a metal baseball bat and a concrete paving slab, and they admitted that they did that from the offset. And they were initially jailed for murder, but they later agreed a plea bargain deal. That was 2 years ago with the US prosecutors after there was an appeal, and they admitted the voluntary manslaughter of Jason Corbett and served that last short period of time in prison, and then they were released.
Yeah.
And that's really where it's at for Sarah and her brother and the rest of the family. They have done their time, they're out. They've certainly shown no remorse since, neither Molly nor her father.
And obviously she continues to blacken Jason's name. I mean, that's one part of what that family have had to go through, was because Jason is dead, he can't defend himself. And she had basically had free rein to paint Jason, and not only as an abusive person, but paint him as having killed his first wife, which was routinely rejected by the medical experts. So in her post, Sarah does kind of address some of that, and she talks about how it took her years to find her voice, and having lived through coercive control and abuse as a child, talking about her treatment at the hands of Molly Martens. She says, "I know exactly what it does to a child, how it steals your voice, your safety, your sense of reality. Finding my voice again has taken years," she said. And that is why I wrote A Time for Truth, which is the book she wrote, her memoir, not for attention, but to shine a light on injustice, to tell the story from the child's perspective, and to stand with every victim who has been silenced, manipulated, or disbelieved. So that's, I suppose, she's obviously seen this story in the Mail and decided, again,
to take ownership of it back, which is
it is
an honourable thing for her to do, because
it is, because again, even then she has to say, "I don't want any comments," because she constantly has to put herself out there. And that's a difficult position that family have been left with, and many victims of crime have been left with. If they don't say anything, a narrative goes out there. But if they do want to say something, they have to keep putting themselves out there in public. But she's very, very, very articulate young woman.
So Molly Martens had recently returned to social media, and she's going under the moniker of Molly Bell. after her favourite Disney princess Belle from Beauty and the Beast, so far removed from what happened in that house in North Carolina that night
Yeah.
when Jason Corbett was beaten and battered to death by her and her father. She'd only up to now posted these sort of photos, like landscape photographs and scenes and stuff. But now she's sort of revealed her new profile image, looking very blonde and very young and, her whole life ahead of her. Now, a Martens family member did speak to a US media outlet and confirmed that both her and her father are doing very well since their release from prison, which again, undoubtedly,
Yeah, look, it's
irritating beyond belief for the family here.
Yeah, it sounds tone deaf. I mean, this is the persistent way that this case is played out. Closure, of course, is possibly a naive concept, but it's literally impossible when you have people continuing to portray themselves as victims.
And because this family member for the Martins said that, while Thomas is doing fabulously well, Molly has elements that recovery is
Yeah.
harder for recovery.
Yeah.
She's in the kind of thick of her life and she has not retired. This family member said there's been a lot of media attention and harassment. She struggles a little bit more with the trauma.
Yeah.
But overall, she's really grateful and she's doing really well, all things considered. She's traumatized.
Yeah. You see, this is so I suppose it's a sign of who she is, Molly Martens, despite all of her media appearances, and there were many, despite all of the court evidence, and there was much of it, and despite all her social media posts, she's never in all that time taken any degree of responsibility for any of her actions. And this is, I suppose, the sign of her true underlying personality. No matter what, she could take responsibility for part of what she did, even if she was in denial or whatever about some of it. But to take no responsibility for anything, it must be very hard for the Corbett Lynch family to continue to hear that. And as we can see with Sarah, she seems really strong, but it must be a burden to see, when you know that her father is never coming back, and to see a new picture of somebody glammed up, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, anyway, no doubt we'll be talking about this again.
Okay, thanks, Nicola.